Welcome back. I'm Miranda Kahn. Cuba-U.S. relations were frozen for 55 years until a year ago yesterday when President Obama announced he would normalize relations between the two countries. Here's the president on his goals for Cuba.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. Through these changes, we intend to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people.
However, as time progressed, many feel the Cuban government isn't trustworthy enough to live up to its end of the deal. Here's Bob Menendez, Democratic Senator from New Jersey, on the Senate floor.
So today, 10 months later, the metrics of this new policy show it's clearly headed in the wrong direction.
And here to look at the changes and the direction of our relationship with Cuba, we have Luis Fleischman, the senior advisor to the Mangus Hemispheric Security Project at the Center for Security Policies. Also with us, Mauricio Claver-Carone, the executive director of Cuba Democracy Advocates. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So you heard the president's goal. It's been a year now. Mauricio, I know that you specialize in Cuban-U.S. relations. A lot of people are wanting to do business with Cuba. Tourism has gone up. Is that a sign that Obama is getting what he wanted?
Well, first and foremost, we have to understand what the Cuban market is. And the Cuban market is essentially one entity. Cuba is not Costa Rica. When you do business with Cuba, you're not doing business with a whole bunch of private companies and individuals. You're doing business with one entity, which is essentially the Cuban regime through its military and intelligence apparatus. All business with Cuba, all foreign companies that have done business in Cuba have to do so in minority joint partnerships with a conglomerate called Gaesa, which is owned by the Cuban military. Article 18 of the Constitution requires that all foreign investment and all foreign trade with Cuba must be done through the state. Therefore, we're not talking about interaction with people. The grand irony here when American businesses talk about the Cuban market and wanting to get into Cuba is that essentially who the Cuban market is in Cuba for them are Americans. So essentially an American mouth that you could be feeding or servicing in Miami Beach is one that they now want to service in Varadero Beach in Cuba. That's a big anomaly here. At the end of the day, what we want and what we want to ensure is the day that the Cuban people can be free so that they can interact in a private capacity between American companies, American individuals, American entrepreneurs, and them. That is not permitted right now by the totalitarian dictatorship in Cuba, and that's what we seek to change for.
What I think is really interesting is, you know, you have the president saying that he wants to normalize relations, and yet you just had an official from Cuba saying that Obama can visit as long as he doesn't meddle in their affairs. Luis, you say we shouldn't just be concerned about Cuba, but we should be concerned about Cuba's influence on other Latin countries. What do you mean by that?
Well, absolutely. What Cuba does is in our interest. It's not just the internal affairs of Cuba. Not only because of the human rights issue, which is a very serious, it's a concern of many people who live in the United States, U.S. citizens, but also because Cuba today is the main supporter of the Venezuelan repressive apparatus. And today Venezuela is a is a narco state, all right? And is also a state that supports terrorism, even though it has not been categorized as such in, by the State Department as yet. Hopefully it will. I don't know whether it will, but hopefully. Therefore, and today Venezuela represents a security threat to the United States. There is no question about it. There are several countries in the hemisphere that are following the footsteps of the Venezuelan government. That includes Bolivia, that includes Ecuador, includes Nicaragua. If these people want to establish totalitarian regimes, repressive regimes, they will resort to Cuba. And that means if Cuba continues to support these kind of regimes that eventually end up being rogue regimes, and that's a possibility. I'm not saying that Bolivia or Nicaragua or Ecuador are still in the same stage like Venezuela, but that could happen definitely. So for us, it's extremely important to raise that in the negotiations, and we haven't done it. As far as I'm concerned, it has not been done. The opposite. The Obama administration sought to normalize relations with the Venezuelan government as we know it now, without not with the new government, not with the new parliament, but with the government, the current government.
In the short time that we have remaining, last word to you, Mauricio, but if you were advising the president, what advice would you give him?
First and foremost, that he needs to make sure that when you talk about normalizing relations, that we're not normalizing relations with the totalitarian dictatorship, which is the message that's being sent, which is why we're having a huge increase in amount of Cubans that are fleeing the country. Think about the message. You're at a time when you have an octogenarian dictatorship on its last leg, with Venezuela falling apart, which has been its economic spigot, and we're looking now to replace that economically and empowering it politically. The message that's being sent to the Cuban people is that your future is that of this dictatorship versus having an elected representation in the future, which is whom we should be normalizing relations with in the future. Not to lose the opportunity for the next generation as opposed to normalizing it with the past, which is what the president is doing.
And we'll have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come here on Newsmax Now, focus on the family founder James Dobson picks a candidate in the GOP race. We'll give you all the details after the break.